Everybody, we got some stupendous news. We're finally a young and hip podcast. Thanks to Florian Kleinu, Dr. Florian Kleinu, we are finally doing a show on Carl Gustav Jung. We've been running Talk Gnosis, it pre-existed before me for over a decade now, yet somehow we've neglected this incredible thinker who's been influential on so much modern Gnostic thought, and Jung himself said that classic Gnostic thought was an influence on him. Florian, thanks so much for coming on. But can you give us the overview? Who was Jung?
So historically, worked at the turn of the 20th century. Uh, he was a student of Sigmund Freud. Originally, he was a student of medicine like Freud. He studied with Freud and sort of continued to develop his notions of the unconscious, where he ultimately went on to split from Freud over some key concepts that I'm sure we'll go on to touch upon later. He then sort of continued along different trajectories from Freud entirely. But that's sort of the realm he was in. He was also a psychoanalyst. He drew heavily upon the notions of the unconscious. And well, he was Swiss. I think maybe that's for those who don't know anything about Jung, he was Swiss. And spent his life living in Switzerland.
Extremely awesome. And Jung has had a big impact on our culture, a big impact on many important thinkers, very influential on many artists. But at the same time, I don't know if I would exactly call him mainstream. How did you get interested in him and his work?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't quite remember myself. I was interested in Taoism at a quite a young age. I lived in China for a while, for a couple of years. After I graduated high school, I moved to Beijing and lived there for a few years, to learn Chinese initially, and then I stayed to work. And at that time, I was reading Taoist texts. I was reading the I Ching. I was reading the Tao Te Ching, and Jung wrote an introduction to the I Ching, and a commentary on another Taoist text, the text of the Golden Flower, or whatever it's translated as in English. I'm not sure. My mother tongue is German. I read most of the stuff in German. But that sort of got me interested in his thinking, and the whole idea sort of the Tao, very similar to Jung's worldview, with sort of the synchronicity as sort of the background noise of reality, if you will. That got me interested in Jung. I first read his works on alchemy, and then later get into sort of more systematic, psychoanalysis, psychology. While I did study neuroscience and psychology in undergrad, so that was sort of a little loop around the corner that got me back to Jung then.
Yeah, that's really cool. Usually in English, it's translated as "Secret of the Golden Flower," though I've seen some different titles for it. Yeah. I'm sure we'll be talking more about that as well. But it's a Taoist manual for inner alchemy, so very fascinating text that Jung got a lot out of, and people can get a lot out of today. But yeah, I didn't realize that the Taoism was your entry point. That's really interesting. Okay, so if you can take us through some of his major ideas, sort of a huge question. Some of these ideas can be very complex, but again, the overview, which I guess we got to start with the big one, which is an idea that he builds upon, but the unconscious.
Right, right. So I think the starting point here, and I guess schools of psychoanalysis disagree on this already, but the starting point is that we're born either with nothing at all or with an ego, and then either the unconscious grows, or as Jung puts it, the unconscious is formed, or as Jung puts it, we're born sort of into a space that is unconscious, collective unconscious for Jung, and then from that, what we call the ego differentiates, or as Jung says, sort of in the first phase of individuation, individuate or start to differentiate, right? And a personal unconscious then develops as well. So Jung proposes two layers essentially of the unconscious. So you have, if you will, the ego, or the realm of consciousness, of which the ego is the core, and then you have sort of the personal unconscious as a layer below this ego, beneath this ego, to an extent formed by this ego, and the collective unconscious, as Jung hypothesizes, as a realm that we're born into, that is sort of preeminent, where it precedes us, if you will. So that's the very basic very basic architecture. You have then the ego again, sort of obviously has unconscious components. We can maybe talk a little more about that. So the ego is as being, let's say, not entirely its own agent. It's controlled sort of by these unconscious factors. And then, of course, the ego, that's sort of at the bottom layer, if you will, of the ego. And then at the top layer of the ego, you have the persona, sort of the mask that we wear or the mask in plural that we wear in multiple social situations to sort of interact with society on that level. But
Yeah.
we'll get into each of those in more detail.
Excellent, excellent. Well, yeah, that's just what I was about to say. I think a lot of people at home who maybe don't know Jung, they're nodding along. This makes sense. I know about the unconscious, or at least ideas of the subconscious, of ego, of persona. That sounds rational, elegant. I've had some personal experience out in my own life and counseling, even if they are not connected in any way to psychoanalysis or any school of psychoanalysis. But you mentioned the collective unconscious there a few times. That might be an idea that'll blow some people's minds. That might even be difficult to accept. So, can you tell us more about Jung's theories of the collective unconscious, what it is, how it works? Yeah, fill us in.
I think maybe let's start with the personal unconscious to sort of tease out the differences here. So if we think about the personal unconscious, what we would classically think about in the sort of Freudian views, that basically there are aspects of the life that we live that we cannot cope with, or that for some other reason are split from the ego. Now, to understand that, we have to sort of think about, okay, what is the ego? Essentially, I always like to say the ego is the kind of the story that we tell about ourselves in a way, right? We narrate. I like to think of the ego as sort of a narrative. Um, that has to do with the work in psychology that I've been doing. And I think it fits well with Jung. But anyways, the ego is sort of that which we believe we are. And although we cannot recall all of it, I always like to compare it to the photo library that we have on our phones. Like, you can go through it and you'll ultimately find what you're looking for. But there are gaps, right? And some pictures you deleted, maybe some pictures other people have deleted, some pictures were, let's say, automatically deleted in a way, you know, by accident, by your phone in the metaphor, and the pictures that are sort of the gaps, so that which is not there, is what we will call, and especially those pictures that are deleted purposefully, in the quotation marks, right? Repression, well, purposeful action, obviously. That would be sort of cast into the unconscious, right? That's the personal unconscious.
Right.
Now, the ego then is sort of that which you build, very precisely built around, the that which makes those pictures hang together, the kind of the story you build. And again, you have a reference book. You can say, oh, well, I have this pain in my knee. Well, actually, it's because yesterday I tripped over this, something like that. And if you can build this, the pain doesn't have to disturb you so much, because you can interpret it. You can build and interpret a framework, starting with the very fundamental assumption that you're a functioning body that is sort of the same today and tomorrow. And so this is a very broad understanding, I think, of sort of what we can understand at the ego. Now, the unconscious, then the personal unconscious, again, we've discussed this repository of repressed content, to a large extent. Now, the collective unconscious for Jung is, to put out a hypothesis here, or a statement that we can discuss, is the fundament of all reality, if you will. So physical reality on the one hand, and then psychic reality on the other hand. And I like to think of the collective unconscious as that which the structures, or gives you affords you the trajectory along which you can then build, let's say, it exists psychological existence, and in some interpretation, even a physical existence. Now, um, maybe to fill that with life a little bit, um, essentially, the way I like to think about the psyche is that, again, you have these different small elements that you grasp, that you sort of take in, right? Those elements could be compared to the books behind me on the shelf. It's like these different elements, and those elements have to somehow be organized within your psyche, in the realm of the psyche. And Jung proposes that the collective unconscious offers you a space in which those elements can be organized preeminently. Now, offer sounds like you have a choice. In fact, you don't, right? It's what you're born with. And this doesn't mean, as a little sort of, you say, well, anyways, it doesn't mean that you don't, that this collective realm doesn't evolve. Let's just say that it doesn't mean that it's fixed. It's always been the same. You inherited in quotation marks. But it's it is an evolving sort of realm for Jung as well. But
Sorry to
in
interrupt.
essence,
I really want to. I hope you weren't in a groove. I just want to put a little pinpoint in that because I think that is a big misunderstanding about Jung's thought, or like pop culture understanding of Jung's thought. So I just want to highlight that as very important because it's something that I have encountered a lot. So sorry, Florian, you were on a roll and I I got in there and interrupted it.
no, it's funny. Please interrupt me.
Yeah.
And I think to stay with the pop culture, I think I haven't mentioned the archetypes at all. And that's sort of on purpose, in a way, on purpose, because I think the archetypes are there. We have to make a differentiation very early if we think about the archetypes, and that's you have archetypal images, and that would be something like the you know the Jack Sparrow as a trickster figure, for example, and in Pirates of the Caribbean, that would be an archetypal image. It would not be an archetype, right? It would be the archetype would be the sort of again the nucleus around which such images may cluster within the life, sort of the shelf itself, right? The shelf that we see would be the archetype, if we want to say that one. So the trajectories, when I say trajectories, that's what you want to refer to as the archetypes. And you have certain trajectories that are quite fundamental, like the relationships to our parents, for example. It's a very fundamental archetype. But what I always like to use as an entry point to sort of get people thinking about archetypes is think about instincts, right? Instincts are quite simple and quite natural to us. The bird will build a nest in the head, in the garden, rather in the tree, and the bird doesn't think about, oh, I want to build this nest here today. Or maybe I want to build it in the barn. The bird either builds a nest in the barn or under the roof or in the hedge or in the tree. And that's sort of an instinctual movement because this is where maybe this sort of mystical unity side comes in on a very simple level, because they co-evolve, to stay in terminology that people like, co-evolve with nature in a way that nature provides exactly the space, and the bird comes into this space, and together they create this quality that we then call sort of an archetypal action or an archetypal gesture. And right, I think maybe that to sort of briefly describe the collective unconscious. Um, yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing, and I think that's a very succinct explanation. It's very clear. I think people are going to be able to grasp it if they're not haven't been exposed to this idea before. Because again, not to beat a dead horse, keep bringing this up. The way the collective unconscious is often presented, if you do run across it, is the confusing, the complicated, overly mystical. But I think the way that you phrase it is excellent. So thanks so much.
I think
And
the mystical,
oh, go ahead.
sorry, I think the mystical experience is precisely the sort of the effect of archetypal images can have on us, right? I mean, Jung says this very clearly. The unconscious. I don't know if people are familiar, or if you're familiar. You're probably familiar with it, with Rudolf Otto's book on the holy. Um, and Otto describes sort of the effects of the holy on the sort of in the Christian context, on people, I think, in general, not only on believers. He describes, the feeling you have when you walk into a church and you hear the choir singing, the organ playing, or simply witness the sort of, and then he uses the term, the tremendous force, or the tremendous, he calls it the tremendum of the sort of the church that is upon you, let's say. And archetypes are experienced in a similar way. Otto uses the term numinist, that Jung then co-opted, to describe the experience of the archetypal. And I think one reason for that is because the archetypes are, in a way, a space of familiarity. I always like to think of it as this moment you realize that there is a lot more than you, and there's an element of fear, but there's an element of comfort, and it's this sort of, you have goosebumps. I have goosebumps right now. You have goosebumps because there's this just this feeling of connectedness. I don't mean this in sort of a new age way, but it's simply this, the collective unconscious, the archetypes, again, are shared and inherited, and they're shared by not only the past, but by the present and the future. So, you are part of something that's greater, something that's evolving, something that's always going to be there. And I think the sort of luminosity, and maybe the bird feels a luminosity when the bird builds the nest in the tree, when they discover and that the first time, well, this is where I should build a nest. You know? Maybe I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's awesome, and at the same time, while I'm being kind of critical of this, the some of these interpretations, understandings, misunderstandings of collective unconscious, I don't want to completely scientize it because, of course, Jung had a very deep relationship with religion, with mysticism, with myth, the importance of myth. And even if you don't know Jung, people are probably kind of figuring out that the archetypes of collective unconscious are related to some of our ideas about religion, our experiences of religion, like you're saying, of the numinous. And the archetypes are often connected to the figures that we find in myth, fairy tale, fiction. Is that right?
Yeah. So essentially, Jung called all of these um, sources that you just described products of the psyche. So for him, his main source was precisely this material. So of course, also casework. There's a lot of many volumes in his collected works about with casework, especially dreams and and free associations, the technique Jung developed. Of course, therapeutic work. Um, but especially prominent, and I think this is the main difference between him and other schools of psychoanalysis, psychology in general, are these products of the psyche. Essentially, what he says is, look, this is what humans wrote. This is what the psyche produced in a specific date, in a specific perhaps moment. He always says these archetypal texts or the archetypes themselves grew in a time where consciousness was still in its sort of baby shoes. I don't know if this makes sense in English, but it was still very, the light was very dark, the light of consciousness, the metaphor. It wasn't very, again, because perhaps I have to say this, sorry, maybe this is a bit confusing, but consciousness doesn't only develop within the lifespan of the individual, right? From this darkness of the unconscious, you develop and unfold a sort of a light in order to then build a relationship with the darkness around you, right? That's sort of an image that Jung, the two phases of the individuation process. But consciousness also historically develops, and Jung proposes that there was a time where consciousness was not as strong as now, and it sort of develops. And he's very critical of this development. He sees that many of the catastrophes that he witnessed in his lifetime in the 20th century in Europe are connected to precisely this sort of the hubris or the all of the ego, because the ego precisely has to maintain this relationship with the darkness around it. Well, we can get to this later, maybe.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, it's well, it's basically my next question, but I think that's an awesome explanation. And yeah, so you're talking about the light, you're talking about the dark. What is the shadow for Jung?
so the shadow essentially, very sort of succinctly, is the shadow that is cast by the light. Yeah, and the light in this case would be consciousness, would be the ego. So that which the ego cannot work with within its narrative would be cast in the shadow. Now, for some, the shadow is sort of the shadow is a metaphor for what we would call the personal consciousness, actually this repressed content. But Jung also says that the shadow reaches down all the way to hell, and this means that the shadow has two aspects. It has the personal aspect and the collective aspect. Now,
Mm.
the personal aspect of it, again, would they are at least elements of these repressed memories. Now, not all of them, but especially for Jung, this sort of the those elements that are threatening to sort of the stability of the ego, if you will. But then on the other hand, there's an element to society where the shadow is repressed as certain, often it's weaknesses, often it's fears, often it's societal, sort of that which you deny to be in society. Um, so that could be that those are aspects of the shadow. Now, the shadow, I think, what many people may think of, I'm not sure, but is sort of the shadow in a projected state. So often you say, for example, um, oh, your neighbor, he probably has, he probably tortures his cat. I don't know, something like, probably an evil person or whatever. The whole notion that Jung put forth is, well, look, why do you think that is true? Have you ever witnessed him torturing a cat? Probably not. Now, does he sort of did he ever make any gestures? Did he even mention anything? Probably not. Now, why do you think he tortures a cat? Would you like to torture a cat? You know what I mean? Or maybe have you tortured a cat? So it's this sort of this projection, this sort of outward, again, projection, quite literally, of shadow elements happens on a social level as well. Now, certain groups are victims of shadow projection all the time. That was for Jung, for example, the whole Holocaust of the was a shadow projection quotation marks of the German people onto the Jews. So that's a quite interesting and relatable. I always like to and now you can think of all this sort of all the attributes that are attributed with such groups of people. Now it's important also to say that every light casts a shadow. And maybe one more word about the shadow in relation to Jung's function, psychological functions. Now I don't think this is something we'll get into very much, but Jung proposed certain cognitive functions to be at work in the psyche. And there, for example, you can say on a very basic level, you're extroverted. There's an extrovert introvert sort of field within which people for. And for Jung, all these functions are always present. So every person's always extrovert, introverted. You're never just an extrovert, but you're both. But one of those functions would be sort of more in the shadow than the other. And now this function that's more in the shadow than the other is precisely the function that's sort of where you're most, let's say, vulnerable at. So whenever you sort of have a conversation with someone and you say something and you strike a nerve, that you know that you fit something relevant there, something in the shadow, something that they can still cast light on, right? But ultimately, you cast a light on that, something else will fall into the shadow again. So that's
Right. An important question I forgot to put on the sheet, Flo, but I know you can go with the flow and probably be able to speak eloquently on this, which is the synchronicity. What is a synchronicity?
right. So a synchronicity, in essence, is sort of the occurrence of an acausal moment within time. Now, what that means is you have two instances. Typically, we say one instance would be in one psychological, another material, and they're somehow connected by meaning, but they're not causally connected. So for a classical example would be, for instance, the example that Jung had a patient where I think I talked about this before. Jung had a patient where that he was seeing was a man, and this man was seeing him and talked, and his wife told him, I think the day before. So the wife of the man who was his patient told him the day before, oh, he has heart issues, maybe you can have a look at him. And so Jung had to look at him and said, I sent him to the cardiologist, no problem, everything's fine. He's on his way back home. And no, yeah. So the wife called and said, well, is everything all right with him? Are you sure? Saying this to Jung. And you're like, yeah, he's on his way home. Everything's great. And Jung asked, why do you call? Well, there was a flock of bird on my house. And every time a member of my family died, it happened twice with her mother and a grandmother, I think. There were birds on my roof. So I was worried. Like, no, it's fine. And it turned out that in this precise moment, not precise moment, but around that time, the man had a heart attack and died. In Europe. And now, why is the synchronicity? You have a connection between the birds and the death of a person, right? A lot. Now, both of these occurrences are physical, if you will, but the meaningful connection between this is on multiple levels. First, you have a personal level. The woman had experienced the connection between these two occurrences before. But then, and this is quite interesting, you have an archetypal level where the bird is a symbol for sort of the soul leaving or entering the body. Rather is an archetypal image. You have this sort of in many amazing Egypt, the Bible as well. So the reason why this is called again a synchronistic experience is because these two occurrences occur in conjunction with each other. They don't have to occur at the same time, and they don't have to occur in the same place. It's very important. Strictly speaking, they could occur, one event could occur in, it could be a window breaking here in Germany and something else happening in the United States or Canada, would still be a synchronistic moment if there was some kind of meaningful connection between those events. And these events could also be displaced in time, still be synchronistic if there was a meaningful connection.
Um, we're talking about Jung, but a little Freudian slip. I wrote what is integration on the question sheet. I think I meant to write what is individuation, but I'll ask both. Hey, what is integration and individuation, Florian?
It's conjunctive, actually. I mean, we can talk about integration in the context of individuation, perhaps. So
Please.
individuation essentially has, well, it literally involves integrating the conscious and the unconscious components of the psyche. So individuation has essentially two phases. There's the phase of the first phase of like half of life, Jung says, although it doesn't have to be half. And I don't believe that these two phases are this distinct on a global level. But anyway, the first the first phase is the phase where the ego essentially differentiates from, and now we have to introduce a new term, from self. Now, what is the self? The self is essentially the objective core of the psyche. Jung says that the ego is the subjective core of the psyche. Now, again, the story you tell about yourself, the narrative you have, while the self is the objective core of the psyche, connected, as you may have guessed, to the collective unconscious. Now, the self is sort of the, if you think about it as the surface of water, the self would reach down into the collective unconscious while the ego stays conscious and to some extent in the collective unconscious. So the self is essentially your pathway into the collective, your and the self and the ego, again, have a connection. And this connection in the first moment when you're born is the self is entirely wrapped around the ego. So the ego is not differentiated from the self. Now, we said earlier, the ego is not differentiated from the collective unconscious, and these terms are used interchangeably beyond where you could say the self is sort of describes the whole of the psyche, everything there is. Now, over time, the ego, breaks out of the self, just like the child sort of breaks out of the connection to its mother and its father to that extent, but more its mother. And that's also why Jung sometimes speaks of this first moment of the uvoboic state, where you're literally encompassed by this womb-like everything in a way. Now, there's a differentiation going on. The ego differentiates, breaks apart from the self, and the full sort of break between them would be sort of the final achievement of the first half of individuation, if you will. Now, the second part of individuation, the second phase, requires a reconnection of the ego to the self. And that is precisely the work that we talk about when we say integration. First half is more concerned with, building a stance in society, getting a job, blah, 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 all that. But essentially building a strong narrative of who you are, a strong protective shield, let's say, against trauma, which is considered sort of ego death, like literal certain elements in your ego being ruptured. So being attacked, if you will, by what I call negative judgment. So when people say, oh, the dogs are actually bad, but you think dogs are great, and when people are part of you, you're not, the world's not going to be shattered, and for a child that happens, your children, like you say, no, you can't have the ice cream. Their world breaks down, man. Like, understandably when it's warm. But in any case, the second part is more related then to integrating the shadow, for instance, dealing with, working through, you may say, other archetypal figures. The anima is an important, animals are an important entry point into the unconscious, but it's essentially about integrating that which the ego didn't consider you to be. So casting more light onto the whole of the thing. Now, if you allow me to make a couple of remarks here,
Please.
I would propose that the differentiation of these phases into first half of life and second half of life is not entirely accurate. It's often interpreted as that, but I think it's more an ongoing process. There's some aspect of your life, from a certain time on, some aspects of your life, you're further along of this development than in others. In some aspects, you're already trying to integrate. In some aspects, you're still trying to build a firm standing. And so it's in a healthy sort of development. I would say it's a process that's always interdependent. Maybe after this process of integrating something, you have to build a little bit of ego strength again, because it's difficult and painful to integrate, right? And that's number one. And number two is, I don't think individuation can ever be fulfilled or achieved. And this leads us to the alchemical quest, I'd say, right? Where gold has never been found. And it leads to the alchemical quest because individuation is not only dependent on you. It's the idea that the microcosm and the macrocosm have to be sort of, again, consolated. They fall together. Whatever I do, the world depends on, and whatever the world does, I depend on. So it's also a lot related to sort of getting in tune and into resonance with this collective space, which is in the end a collective space. I think often individuation is read as this process that I can just go through myself, and I can sit here and draw a mandala and everything's good, fine. And but I don't see it that way. I see it as a bigger and unfulfillable quest in the end.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you took the time to explain that, and that was something that I really learned a lot, gained a lot of for your course at the Global Center for Advanced Studies on Jung. Which, by the way, is that course archived? Can people take it as an archive course,
Yeah.
or did they have to take it live?
No, it's archived. You can take it as an archive course. You can send me email. I can put my email in the chat. I can give you access.
Okay.
Or you could take it next year. It's going to happen again next year. We may even have a live course on Jung in the Alps, in the Austrian Alps, but in the Alps coming up next fall. So, but that
Yeah. Amazing,
yes.
amazing. Because in that course, again, I'm often I have read Jung, but I haven't read Jung in a long, long time. And a lot of times I get just second, third hand Jung. I get sometimes a more pop culture Jung, for want of a better word, new age Jung, new age misunderstandings of Jung. So I think there is a really common idea out there that this individuation is permanent. It's almost like a secular enlightenment, right? Or what people think of as Buddhist enlightenment. You become sort of a it almost maybe superhuman is a bit of an over exaggeration, but you become this completely peaceful, at ease, secularly divine creature, right? And in your reading of Jung, that's not what happens.
First of all, I don't think that's what happened, even if you would be individuated, because in the end, individuation is, I think a lot of these differently start differently. A lot of these images are display people that are very compliant with everything that's going on. It's like, oh, everything's all right. And that's an attitude that's great. But in the end, it's a compliant attitude. I think the process of realizing itself is on the one hand, in integration with the collective. On the other hand, though, it's also in integration with your aspect of that. So you become yourself and a confident version of yourself, which means that you will obviously confidence always need again. You can't get rid of the shadow, even if your light grows that big. You can't get rid of it. And perhaps that would also be hubris. If you want to get rid of this, if you want to get rid of darkness entirely, what you're essentially saying is you want to control everything. You want to, because that's what the ego always thinks, right? It seeks control.
Yeah.
And so I think both of these extremes don't apply, right? On the one hand, the ego, you can't let go of the ego. That's also common New Agey sort of interpretations, like, oh, let go of your ego. You can't, because that's literally the fundament of communicating, of living in the world and existing even in a world that is, even if you live in isolation, you still have to sort of narrate yourself through the day, if you will. You still need to get up, and you need to, I think it's an interesting image, the realization of the self only happens in death. I read it somewhere, you can only the moment you allow your ego sort of, or infinity, perhaps, perhaps psychotics are much closer to, psychotics will have a lot of access, very direct access to the collective unconscious, right? Because there's no ego barrier. But that's not what you want that's not the images you see. You see those, everything's going to be all right, you'll be fine, which is literally what people want to hear. And I don't think that there's a lot we want to hear to be found in the process of individuation.
Yeah. No, no, that's awesome. Thanks so much. So I'm not jumping in with a lot of comparisons and connections to Gnostic thoughts and Gnosticism because I think that's going to be a different show. With the this show is so important because I'm going to be linking this show as the prelude so that people will be well versed in Jung. But that said, I do want to bring in some esoterica, something that a lot of people are going to think of as mystical, which is alchemy, which we've actually mentioned a few times. But wasn't he inspired by alchemy? And isn't alchemy like that's a bunch of silly superstition, right? It's about crazy people who are ignorant. They're trying to turn lead into gold. How could that inspire Jung?
Right. I think in the first place, the alchemical quest was it was quite interesting, right? Because I think for the alchemist, it wasn't only idea that at some point all the metals would be purified into sort of the purest metal, gold, and gold also being a symbol for consciousness, right? For the divine, if you will, right? Silver, so the earth. And I think that, but on the other hand, the alchemical quest for Jung, and this is how he read it, was precisely a metaphor for the process of individuation. He thought that the alchemical quest was actually a psychological quest, a quest that was externalized, projected into the material, right? Projected onto the matter that they were dealing with. And the retorts of the vessel in which they were working is actually the psyche, right? That for Jung, that's the interpretation. And again, we see this in the impossibility of the achievement of the alchemical quest, right? The impossibility of the achievement of individuation. We see this in many of the operations. We have a long interpretation. It's I think in the GCAS class, I mentioned some of the different phases. But you have a lot reflected here, and that's why Jung uses alchemy as sort of this fundament of this, or one of the fundamental readings of the individuation process.
Yeah. So you have an interesting academic background and an interesting career background, but you have done some academic study of psychology, what we call modern scientific psychology, and hasn't Jung's work been proven to be false? Isn't doesn't modern psychology just more or less completely say it's a bunch of bunk?
If I mean, again, I think first it depends on what you mean by true and false, right? I think there's the modern psychology has a certain perspective, and within that perspective, within that scientific worldview, you can test certain hypotheses, and even assuming that the tests that we do have or bear truth or are transferable to the real world, first in their statistic methods, and second in their sort of well, let's say in their applicability in general. There's still a space for, let's say, work that is not concerned precisely with this space. You know, Jung was concerned with with hypotheses that are, let's say, beyond ego psychology. That's, I think, precisely what he wanted to go beyond. And most of modern psychology works on that level of ego psychology. And I don't want to go into, I mean, you can now say that, you know, quantum physics confirms some of the hypotheses that Jung had on the, you know, the collective unconscious being a shared layer of meaning, you know, the dual aspect monist interpretation. And that's certainly an interesting path for someone's interested in that. I mean, you could read some of the works on dual aspect monism, and Jung. Carl Gustav wrote some books on that. That's an interesting read, certainly. And if you read further into synchronicity, Marie-Louise von Franz, one of Jung's students, he developed synchronicity a lot further, and the idea that sort of, again, psyche and matter are simply one, and they're interdependent and so on. And you do have also, I mean, something we know for in psychology is that the actions that we take are preceded by brain activity, if we could measure stuff on this level, right? But that's something we have confirmed as an hypothesis, and that tells us something about the autonomy that we have about and over our action, and tells us something about sort of the let's say the you know, the question of what steers or how dependent we are on certain pre-existing structures. And now you, again, if you stay at a very naturalistic level, materialist level, you can say that the nature that we encounter and the culturation that we receive are, but precisely all the nature that we encounter are the fundament of these archetypal sort of templates or trajectories that we then live out. Now, I think you don't have to be a metaphysician to read Jung. There's a book by Anthony Stevens,
Cool.
Natural History of the Self, and that talks a lot about this sort of materialist approach to understanding the archetypes, and a lot from psychology and behavioralism as well. So that's an interesting entry point.
Absolutely. Do you feel you know, personally, professionally, philosophically, is Jung's work needish in the modern day in some vital way?
Right. I think in many ways, I think first, and perhaps the main reason why it's needed is because a lot of Jung prompts us to take a look at what is around us, to recognize ourselves within the actions that we take and the actions that others take, and to recognize us as interdependent with other people, with our history, with our future and our past and our present, excuse me. So um, on that level, simply speaking, you have a lot in sort of the ecological crises that we're perhaps existing in, and sort of humanitarian crisis that exist, and you have a lot of hope in you, or a lot of perspectives on that. There is also, I think, on the individual level, um, a great, let's say, chance in your own to move away from a framework where you think you have your own destiny in your own hand, and you can say, well, I have to achieve everything. There are these imperialist goals that I have to achieve. Certainly, again, that's on one level, that is what you go through. That is what you have to do within the framework that we live in. It would be ignorant to move away, turn away from that. But Jung gives us the hope that there is something beyond that there's something else that has to be integrated, something else that is calling for us.
Hmm.
Something other, let's say, truly in the true sense of the word, something other that is not again ourselves. I think classical psychoanalysis is like, oh yeah, you can discover um, something else in the unconscious, but then again, only kind of yourself and plus a little bit, and for Jung, it's like, no, there's actually something else here, and I think on a very, very mundane level, it is worthwhile studying these products of the psyche, precisely because they are so deeply woven into what we are as a collective. And if you believe in the collective unconscious, the term being in metaphysical, but it doesn't, it's not really relevant. It's simply, if you look at these sources and you think, well, the people that have preceded, that have lived on this earth before me, have written this, and they have had a reason to, for somehow they somehow produced this, right? For somehow this had to do with the way they structured the world around them. Isn't there some reason to believe that this has some application to me, right? Some effect on me. Like, don't I see the world similarly on a very fundamental level? I think that's what Jung brings to the table beyond, the classical, okay, well, ask questions about yourself, reflect on yourself, and so on and so forth. That psychology would follow well.
Absolutely. So we mentioned GCAS, the Global Center for Advanced Studies. For the people watching at home, I've put up your bio from their homepage. It's where I'm doing my master's in psychoanalysis. You not only teach there, but you're the director of the psychoanalysis MA program. Now, an impression I would say it's fair to say that both I and others have of GCAS is that they're really big on Lacan, really, really big on Lacan. Um, thought of Jung and Lacan opposed?
I think many would say yes, right? Lacanian, papers by Lacanian saying, oh yeah, Jung's just self is just a super signifier. No, but I think they work on two different levels. I think that's the fundament that we have here, right? Jung works on the level, again, going beyond the sort of personal level. And Lacan stays on this level of the personal, of the personal unconscious. He's not concerned with the collective. And I think that's a chance, right? If you go beyond the obvious existing differences, the obvious interpretation in consequences for therapy, the obvious different techniques, you could say on a theoretical level, I see them as a great addition. I like reading Lacan, and I like studying in Lacan. Interesting. I'm not as proficient in Lacan as others are, and certainly not as proficient as I am in Jung, but it's interesting. It's interesting to see if you have a supplementary perspective on this sort of personal level, because honestly, Jung's work is, I think, very, very strong on this sort of on this deeper level, and then you can interpret and implications of the personal level, especially the ego. But there's a lot of clinical literature on Lacan, which Jung simply doesn't really have himself to that extent. So I think they're not. But again, I think at GCAP we're definitely, Jungians are or I don't know if they're Jungians in a plural at GCAS. But some of the people now in the MA are interested in Jung. I think it's sort of we're still a shadow function, and I think that's and that's great. Again, like different forces have to compensate each other, and again, in the end, form whole that people can then, use to for whatever they want to use.
Yeah, yeah, it's very appropriate for a thinker who's all about reconciling opposites. I think some exciting things will come out of these intellectual discussions and meetings of the different schools might be too harsh of a term, but you know what I mean. Which is, I've been putting Kleinu publications up on the screen for everybody at home. You have a number of books that you've published. Everybody should go out and buy them. I do want to have you back on the show to talk about those books, particularly
So
the dynamic of the psyche, the process of transformation in the I Ching and Tao Te Ching, because I think our watchers and listeners will get a lot out of that. But tell us about your book. Tell us about where people can find you online, and tell us about your new YouTube channel.
thanks for the space, first of all. And I think, especially the YouTube channel, what I try to do is simply, what I've also tried now is to say, okay, well, here's what Jung said, not necessarily always subjectively, certainly I interpret, but an interpretation that is not on the spiritual side, that some new age stuff is on, and then not leading towards the Jordan Peterson side that I think is very prominent on YouTube, that is, going in the direction of you have to go out, take responsibility for everything, and you know, build meaning and create meaning. I fundamentally don't think meaning can be created. So that is that is sort of the aim of the YouTube channel. But a lot of that is sort of true reading of Jung, detailed discussions of the dynamics of the psyche. Again, the interaction of the ego and the collective unconscious. I think that's what Jung is always concerned with. And there's also what a lot of the books are on. One of the books is on social media. That's maybe an interesting perspective for some, and how that ties into the sort of cutting us off from essentially the influences of the collective or interactions with the collective, and leaving us in sort of a hubris situation, the ego and the situation of hubris. And obviously there's the book on the I Ching, where with more of sort of a meditative self-consciousness, rather than an analysis, detailed word by word analysis. But it was quite a good exercise, I think. And then and always within an hour, the first book I wrote is on so this journey of the subject or the individual, between these sort of three world realms, so the heaven, the archetypes, and then hell, reality, and coming into being in this in the in between space. That's by yeah. So
Perfect.
yeah, I thought you paddle and then take it from here if you like to comment.
Amazing. I'm going to quickly wrap up with a commercial for ourselves. Patreon.com/Gnostic. You can keep the show going for as little as $1 per piece of media per month. That's per piece of media. You can also put a cap on that. Just give us $1. Other people who have podcasts and Patreons, we also have to update the Patreon. We have old information on there. Did they give you stuff? We don't give you anything. We give you love. Because we don't want to create extra content and lock it up behind the paywall is the idea. And I can't think of anything else to give people for signing up for the Patreon. But if I do, you'll get it. We do give the shows out early whenever I remember and have time. We're trying to be as professional as possible, people. But at the same time, there is a limit to our professionalization. Both because of time commitments, but also it's not what we're about. We want to be serious. We want to have serious thinkers. We want to get it out there, but it's not a money-making enterprise for us. That said, we do need a little bit of help to keep the show going. If you can help us, please do. And if you can't, that's cool too. Actually, if you can and you like the show, just tell people about it, rate, review. I know you hear that. Apparently there's other podcasts out there. I'm disgusted by the idea. So you've probably heard this rate and review, but it feeds the algorithm gods, the algorithm archons. You can do one-time donations at paypal.me/Gnostic. And that brings us to the end for now, Florian. It's been awesome. Thanks so much for coming on. Thanks so much for coming on at night before bedtime at your time. So it's been really awesome.
Thank you very much, Ryan.
Okay, bye, everybody.